Hello and welcome to another investigation of some ideas of Confucianism as represented in the Analects. Now, this is a classic picture of, if I'm not mistaken, Confucius meeting Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism. Confucius on the left, Lao Tzu on the right there. So let's put this nifty picture over here in the corner. So that corner looks good. And let's talk about what Confucius says about government, but one thing in particular about government, about means of governing, and in particular how governing should not be based on power and punishment and law so much as on virtue and ritual. Now, if I'm going to say anything about ritual, I really need to have the terminology in place. So let's briefly review the terminology. The key word here is lai. That's me attempting to pronounce in Guangdonghua, Cantonese. The traditional character looks like that. Simplified character looks like that. Li is as good as I know how to do with this transliteration using the pinyin system for transliterating Putonghua Mandarin. In English, this could be translated as ritual or rite. Some translators, I think, will render it as propriety or rules of propriety. Sometimes politeness is used to try to capture the concept here. Let me see if I can give a very brief description of what we're talking about. Lai, or ritual, or rite, is the customs that make us human, the customs by which we live morally, by which we put moral principles into practice. So lai and the personal virtue of a ruler are more effective means of government than law and power and force, according to Confucius. Let's look at two passages on the subject. And then let's clarify one or two things, actually maybe three passages. Okay, so here's the James Legge public domain translation. Here's the not public domain, but conveniently on the internet, Charles Muller interlinear translation. And I also consult the Oxford World Classics translation. Let's look at Book 2. Book 2 of the Analects. The master said, Confucius said, he who exercises government by means of his virtue may be compared to the North Polar Star, which keeps its place and all the stars turn towards it. The ruler who rules by virtue basically has this happy result that the people just automatically follow. Okay, go to the Oxford World Classics translation of the same, but I'm going to see what I'm also wanting to check what they say about. Ah, yes, good. This is good. We'll definitely see what they say in the notes, the explanatory notes in the back. But let's do the translation first. The master said, the practice of government by means of virtue may be compared with the pole star, which the multitudinous stars pay homage to while it stays in its place. In explanatory notes in the back of the book, Oxford World Classics translation tells us, this chapter is reminiscent of Taoist government by inactivity rather than the more interventionist policy of Confucianism, although later Confucian thought did see a cosmic role for the virtuous ruler. Lots of complicated stuff and interesting stuff and subtle ideas there. Let's at least observe Taoism is the philosophy in ancient Chinese thought that's associated more with an inactive government. And here, Confucianism sounds just a little bit like Taoism. Interesting. More on that shortly. Let's quickly check this one. Oh, and see what commentary Muller has kindly added. The master said, Confucius said, if you govern with the power of your virtue, you will be like the North Star. It just stays in its place while all the other stars position themselves around it. This is the Analects' first statement on government, Muller explains. Scholars of Chinese thought have commonly placed great emphasis on a supposed radical distinction between Confucian authoritative government and Taoist laissez-faire government, or very inactive government. Numerous Confucian passages such as this, which suggest of the ruler's governance by a mere attunement with an inner principle of goodness without unnecessary external action, quite like the Taoist Wu Wei or Mo Wei, or inaction, although maybe some other time we need to talk about what Mo Wei, Wu Wei is in Taoism. It's not really inaction. It's probably better understood as minimal natural action. But now's not the time to go into any detail on that, and I'm not entirely sure I'm the right person to explain Mo Wei in any case. I have only working understanding of some of these concepts. Anyway, Muller is saying this is the first statement on government in the Analects, and traditionally people say there's a big distinction between Taoist inactive government and Confucian authoritative government, but numerous passages in Confucian texts such as this suggest governance by a mere attunement with an inner principle of goodness without unnecessary external action, surprising like Taoist inaction or inactive government principles. This is one good reason for us to be careful when making the commonplace Taoist generalization, Taoist Confucian generalizations without qualification. That, I think, is very well put. And note how he doesn't say too much. He says, be careful when making a commonplace generalization that says Confucian government is authoritative and active, Taoist government is inactive and passive. Be careful making that sort of distinction. There is a Taoist aspect to Confucian government, or at least there are aspects of Confucianism that have some correspondence to these Taoist concepts. Now let's scroll down just a bit. The master said, if you govern the people legalistically and control them by punishment, they will avoid crime, but have no personal sense of shame. If you govern them by means of virtue and control them with propriety, they will gain their own sense of shame and thus correct themselves. Now, I think I may want to highlight something here, but too much fiddling with tech. Let me pause this recording. Okay, recording unpaused, and I found what I wanted to highlight, and I highlighted it here. That key term I mentioned, li, ritual or rite. That appears in this passage right there. If you govern the people legalistically and control them by punishment, they will avoid crime, but have no personal sense of shame. If you govern them by means of virtue and control them with propriety, they will gain their own sense of shame and thus correct themselves. If you try to govern people by force, by law and punishment, people will try to avoid getting punished, but they won't have any personal sense of shame at doing wrong. But govern the people by virtue and manage the people by ritual, li, propriety. Yes, good translation, propriety, ritual, rite, R-I-T-E, by ritual or rite or propriety, or I can't find an alternative phrasing, so let's just go with those. Ritual, rite, propriety. Govern the people by lai. They will gain their own sense of shame and thus correct themselves. They'll have an internal sense of morality, and they won't just be trying to avoid punishment. There are things that go deeper than law in making people good. Ritual and virtue, particularly virtue as exemplified in a virtuous ruler, those are two of those things. The leg translation, if the people be led by laws and uniformity sought to be given them by punishments, they'll try to avoid the punishment but have no sense of shame. If they be led by virtue and uniformity sought to be given them by the rules of propriety, they will have a sense of shame and moreover will become good. Rules of propriety instead of just propriety. I'm not an expert. I generally assume Mahler's probably giving us a better translation than Legg. All right, let's go to Oxford World Classics on this passage. The master said, if you lead them by means of government and keep order among them by means of punishments, the people are without conscience and evading. The people evade punishment without conscience if all they're doing is fearing law and punishment. But if you lead them by means of virtue, there's no but. If you lead them by means of virtue and keep order among them by means of ritual instead of propriety or rules of propriety. If you lead them by means of virtue and keep order among them by means of ritual, they have a conscience and moreover will submit. So they will become good, they will submit, or they will correct themselves. I'm not in a position to tell you which is the best translation of they will gain their own sense of shame and thus correct themselves, or they'll have a sense of shame and moreover will become good, or they have a conscience and moreover will submit. I can't tell you what's the best translation here, or what are the subtleties in the language. I can track down the vocabulary. Sometimes I can't do my own translations by any means. I can't track down all that much vocabulary anyway. So what's the concept though? Some things go deeper than law and punishment. and a more effective means of making people be good and not just try to avoid punishment, and indeed correct themselves so that there's no need for punishment, that is an important thing, and such a thing is virtue in the ruler and a government by virtuous ritual, by virtuous customs. Let's see. Where was I? I wanted to check the explanatory notes in the Oxford World Classics, but they don't have it on this passage anyway, so let's just forget about that. Let's go to a quick observation, and then go to one more passage in the text, and then do what we can to clarify, and then wrap up this video. We'll go to Book 12, Section 19 in a moment. Now, let's see. What observation was I going to make? I think I was going to say, yes. Confucius is not opposed to having a criminal justice system. What Confucius thinks is that there should be a whole lot less need for a criminal justice system. And how you avoid needing a criminal justice system is by this stuff, by virtue and ritual, or li, and people having having their own conscience, a well-formed conscience, a conscience formed by virtue and by li, and having the ability to regulate their own behavior. Then you don't really need a criminal justice system so much. So the point is not to get rid of the criminal justice system. The point is to avoid the need of it. That's the Confucian way. I think Confucius would think, and don't quote me on this, but he may say this somewhere in the Analects, and I just can't keep everything in my head. I think he might say that if we would just have virtuous government and proper ritual lay for enough time, in a certain number of years, there would be no need for criminal justice. In the short term, we do need it. Confucius is not opposed to having it. The point is to avoid as much as possible the need of it. It is in my head. I found it. Chapter 9 of what book? So there, I'm looking at one extra passage, apparently. Book 13, chapter 9. No, chapter 11. The master said, if good men were to govern a country in succession for 100 years, that's how long it would take, then they would be able to transform the violently bad and dispense with capital punishments. It might still take a generation, but if we had the right sort of government, virtue would prevail. What was that book? Oh, I already forgot. Section 11, chapter 11, verse 11 of book 13. The master said, if good men were to govern a country for 100 years, they could overcome cruelty and do away with killing. How true this saying is. Even if you have the position of kingship, it would still take a generation of Ren, Yan, a word Muller sometimes, but not always, leaves untranslated. Benevolence, humaneness, humanity, kindness, perfect virtue. Those are some of the available translation. Also, altruism. This is not correct. My notes here are consulting, not just Dawson, they're consulting Lang, Daniel Gardner, Dawson, I think that's the translator of this one, and Muller on available translations. Anyway, where was I? Let's not check Oxford World Classics. We're on a rabbit trail. Let's cut off the rabbit trail now and go back to where were we going to go? 12.19. Book 12, section 19. When asked about government, Confucius says, what do you say? No. Someone asks Confucius about government, saying, what do you say to killing the unprincipled for the good of the principle? Confucius replies, sir, in carrying on your government, why should you use killing at all? Let your evinced desires be for what is good, and the people will be good. The relation between superiors and inferiors is like that between the wind and the grass. The grass must bend when the wind blows across it. The people are like grass. The ruler is like wind. And the people naturally bend when led properly. by the right sort of ruler. And that's a very good thing when the ruler is being good. Let the desire for good on the part of a ruler be obvious, and the people will automatically pretty much do what's right. So book 12, section 19 in Muller, there's the Chinese script. And the question is, suppose I were to kill the unjust in order to advance the just. Would that be all right? And Confucius says, in doing government, what is the need of killing? If you desire good, the people will be good. The nature of the noble man is like the wind. The nature of the inferior man is like the grass. When the wind blows over the grass, it always bends. If you desire good, the people will be good. Let's go to the Oxford World Classics. If you desire good, the people will be good. And again, the relation of this sort of ruler, the influence of this sort of ruler over the people is like the influence of the wind over the grass. Okay, 12.19. 12, chapter 19, section 19. He's asked about government. Question is, suppose I were to kill those who lack the way in order to advance those who have the way. How would that be? I believe we're using the word Dao here, Dou in Cantonese, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Suppose I were to kill, I'm not sure why Muller doesn't use the word way in this translation here, if I'm not missing anything, but character, there's the character for Dao, Dou in Cantonese. Anyway, where was I? Suppose I were to kill those who lack the way in order to advance those who have the way, how would that be? Master Kong, that is Confucius, replied, you are running the government, so what is the point of killing? If you desire good, the people will be good. If you desire good, the people will be good. If you desire good, the people will be good. Let your evinced desires be for what is good, and the people will be good. If you desire good, the people will be good. If you desire good, the people will be good. That sentence is translated exactly the same way by two of our translators. The nature of the gentleman, the word here no doubt is Chunza. Apparently I haven't managed to get into my notes the Cantonese, the Yutping Cantonese, which is the first one I have in these vocabulary notes here. Yutping Cantonese pronunciation, Chunza, something like that. This term, the nature of the nobleman, or the relation of a superior person, or the nature of the gentleman, the Chunza, this term. The nature of that person is as the wind, and the nature of the small man, the lesser person, is as the grass. When the wind blows over the grass, it always bends. All right, let's check book. Where are we? Book 12, section 19. Let me just check the explanatory notes in case there's anything super cool there to observe. That is interesting. Notice that it's not the people, but the small man who bends. So I think that calls for further thought, and I'll just make a quick guess at it. The guess is, one, I've been oversimplifying if I say the relationship of the ruler to the people in this passage is like wind and grass. The people bend when the ruler rules properly, kind of automatically. The people do what's right. Maybe it's more like little people, in a moral sense, will naturally follow the influence of the virtuous ruler. What about all the other people? Well, hopefully they'll also be morally noble people. They'll be like this. They'll be virtuous person, noble person, gentleman, without necessarily being rulers. They'll be that kind of person in the moral sense. Yeah, I think that's probably right. I don't know. These are tentative suggestions. All right, let's go to one cool place. One thing to clarify, and then wrap up this video, I suppose. Perhaps we should try to summarize this passage in just one sentence. It's another passage where Confucius indicates that government by power and punishment and force is not nearly as effective as a virtuous person as a ruler just being good. If the ruler is good, the people tend to automatically be good. They tend to follow the influence of the ruler, or at least whoever is an inferior person tends to follow the ruler. Maybe I should mention there are some cross references here. There's this other classic text, the Great Learning. You know what I should do? I should search for a convenient translation that's available on the internet. And this is terribly annoying because I don't even know what I'm looking at here, but I'm pretty sure he's translated in. There's another classic Confucian text called The Great Learning. There we go. Great Learning. It's also the word for university when you put them together as one word. University, or separately, Great Learning. This text talks about that thing we were just talking about. About how you desire good, the people will be good. And let your evinced desires be for what is good, and the people will be good, that sort of thing. I think Oxford Classics translated the same way. If you desire good, the people will be good. The way to make the people good is for the ruler to be good. And if there's any other detail, it's just make sure that people know you're good. But how do you make sure that people know you're good? Well, actually, it's by being good. It's not, hey, everybody, pay attention to me. I'm a noble ruler. No, it's actually be good. So the Great Learning starts off with this very theme, talking about how wise rulers who wanted to make plain the virtue they were living by, how they did so. And they did so beginning with themselves. They first corrected their own minds. To do that, they corrected their own wills. To do that, they started with knowledge. And actually, starting with, they didn't start with knowledge. They started pursuing knowledge. And that led them to knowledge. Anyway, point I'm making here is only that this passage cross references to some other interesting Confucian texts. Another really interesting one is the Mencius. Mencius, Master Meng. Mengzi is a great Confucian philosopher shortly after Confucius. Well, you know, on the grand scale of things, shortly after Confucius. These days, it seems like it was shortly after. And it's really annoying me that I can't scroll to the right. There we go. There's an old picture of Mencius. Okay, so he says some similar things to this. Now let's finally see if we can clarify something. Now, what I'm about to show you is just a model for thinking through these things. Do not take this as a necessarily correct representation of some positions in ancient Chinese philosophy. Take it as a model for interpreting some positions in ancient Chinese philosophy. Use this model until you find a better one, and you may well. I have suspicions of at least two possible flaws in this model. In fact, the only real point of using this model is to emphasize that it's not binary. Pretty much the same thing Muller was kindly telling us back in the beginning of book 2, where people have often said that there's this big dichotomy between Confucian philosophy of government, where government is active and authoritative, and Taoist philosophy of government, where the government does little or nothing. And it's not binary. It's not government does nothing, government is authoritative and does a lot. There's a huge range between government does little to nothing and government does as much as it possibly can. And I want to emphasize that it's not binary. Now, what is ambiguous is how far along in the spectrum from one direction to the other is Confucianism. That's where I have some doubts. In fact, I would also emphasize it's not just that there's more than one position between government does as little as possible, the position we associate with Taoism, and government is super authoritative and active, which is probably not properly associated with Confucianism. There's a long range between those things, and Confucianism could be somewhere in the middle. But also, there's more than one version of Confucianism. So that's another thing to clarify. It's not like Confucianism is going to be just one point on the spectrum. So now here's a model for thinking through these things. On questions like how many laws should we have and how harsh should punishments be for breaking the law, you could have a position of very many laws and very harsh punishments, or very few laws, even no laws, and no punishments. And that's a large spectrum. And Confucianism talking about how, well, we don't need to kill, we just need to be virtuous. That's the right way to govern. This is not saying there should be no laws, no punishments, no criminal justice system. It's pushing us in the direction of fewer laws. But how far are we really supposed to go? I suspect we're not supposed to go quite as far as Taoism, although Muller is quite right that it's not like Confucianism and Taoism are opposites. I'm not even sure Taoism and legalism are opposites. And now let's mention legalism is a third tradition in ancient Chinese philosophy that at least appears to be on the other side. If there's opposites here, it's not Taoism and Confucianism, it's Taoism and legalism. I'm not sure that's correct either. I suggest this. Think of it as a spectrum. Think of legalism as one side of the spectrum, but it itself is a tradition, and different legalists might have different positions on the spectrum. Han Feizi is a guy in this tradition, and I think he's sort of to that side of that tradition, but he's still on that side, the more authoritative side of the philosophy of government. And then Taoism itself is a tradition, and I'm not really sure where to place Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. Those are two of the Taoist thinkers, but I've given some provisional guesses. Now, Confucius, that's Kongzi here, and Mencius, Mengzi, and Xunzi, pardon my bad pronunciation, these are three Confucian thinkers, and I think they themselves represent different points on the spectrum, but within Confucianism. And I suspect some versions of Confucianism on the milder government side of what's available within the Confucian tradition might be very similar to actual available Taoist positions. And similarly, on the more authoritative side of Confucianism, you might have compatibility with some of the more mild versions of legalism. Now, again, the main point is only that it's not binary. And I can only suggest this as a model to use until you find a better one. How could this model be made better? What's wrong with this model? Well, first of all, I'm not really sure where exactly to place all these people on the spectrum. I'm giving my working understanding of it, my best sense of it. And if you ask me on a different day, I don't know, I might feel like placing Mencius a little farther to the right, or making the Taoist spectrum go a little less far to the left, or something like that. So that's one possible flaw in this model, that I'm estimating where these people are and where the ranges are a little inaccurately. Another possible weakness in the model is I'm merging two questions. How many laws should we have, and how harsh should punishments be? It might be better to make a two-axis chart, and one axis is how many laws should we have, and another axis is how harsh should punishments be for breaking the laws. And it is a possible position that you should have very few laws and very harsh punishments, for example. Or I suppose very many laws and very mild punishments. Those are possible positions. So that's another weakness in this chart. It's merging two questions that should not necessarily be merged. Now, I wouldn't know where to place these guys on a more complicated chart. So just take this if you don't know better. And whatever flaws may be in this chart, I hope you also, I hope you still can learn better if you don't know what the flaws are now. I hope you can learn a better model in some time. I hope I can learn a better model sometime. This is a provisional model for thinking through these things. Let me close by emphasizing that Muller's cautious language here is very good. One good reason for us to be careful when making commonplace Confucian versus Taoist generalizations without qualification. This is a heavily qualified model, and I'm still not sure it's right. But at any rate, it's not a binary question of do we have laws or not, do we have punishments or not. And Confucianism is not, Confucius in these passages is not telling us no law, no punishment. He's pushing us in the same direction that Taoism is pushing us. And even still, he's not pushing us quite as far as Taoism. All right. That's it. That's all. Thanks for watching.